Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan, titled Economy and Employment. Arguably one of the most important chapters in the National Development Plan, because in 2012, this chapter laid out the primary economy and employment related goals that our nation would work toward achieving by 2030. From my analysis of this chapter, I've isolated 11 primary goals that it laid out at the time. So the destination has long been set, but how effectively are we navigating toward this destination? I think it'll be of use to get a sense of our GPS coordinates on the front end of this video. So I'll begin by asking and providing you with an answer to a very important and simple question. Of the 11 economy and employment related goals that in 2012 the government aimed to achieve by 2030, what percentage of these do you think we are on track to achieving? An optimistic 80%, a lukewarm 50%, or maybe a sad 30%? I'll count down from 3 while you land on a number before giving you the real answer. 3, 2, 1. Of the 11 economy and employment related goals that the state set out to achieve by 2030, we are on track to achieving 0% of these targets. 0%. Think of the percentage that you thought we were on track to achieving, as well as the actual percentage of these targets that we're on track to achieving. These numbers should give you a sense of your faith in the state at the moment, as well as the actual trajectory that our nation is headed in. In this video, we'll look through some key areas of Chapter 3, and with the support of a publicly accessible and interactive dashboard which I've compiled, look more closely at the progress toward each of the 11 targets that are set out in this chapter. If you want to jump straight to the good stuff, feel free to access the dashboard through the link in the description of this video. And for those who want a more thorough discussion on Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan, let's get into it. Chapter 3 of the NDP, Economy and Employment. To remind you of the lay of the land when we're speaking about the National Development Plan, recall that the National Development Plan contains 15 chapters. The first 2 of these being introductory and context setting in nature, while chapters 3 to 15 detail the goals that the country aims to achieve by 2030 and the plan for achieving these goals by 2030. In episode 1 of this series, we looked at chapters 1 and 2, understanding the context that our nation found itself in 2012, as well as the overarching long-term vision for our nation as articulated in these first 2 chapters of the NDP. Today, we begin to look more deeply into the specific long-term goals that are set out in the National Development Plan and our progress toward achieving these. In particular, we zoom into the economy and employment-related goals as articulated in Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan. In a nutshell, Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan lays out the approach and goals to rapidly grow the economy and make it adequately labor-absorbing. A growing economy and increased levels of employment. That's what this chapter is about. Over 50 pages, the chapter contains 12 sections, which give a sense of the key characteristics of the South African economy as understood in 2012 and provide a plan for growing the economy and increasing employment. Now, before we delve into the economy and employment-related goals and the progress toward these goals, I think it'll be useful to give you a sense of some of the characteristics of South Africa's economy as laid out in this chapter of the National Development Plan. These characteristics not only give us a view of the context at the time, but also give a useful framing of the nature of our economy at the present moment. Because believe it or not, 14 years later, a lot of the characteristics of our economy, which are described in the National Development Plan, remain the same and in some cases have even been exacerbated. The first key characteristic of South Africa's economy, which is still relevant today, is the fact that we find ourselves in a low-growth, middle-income trap. Economists describe this middle-income trap as a state where a middle-income country, like South Africa, finds itself in the position where its labor is not cheap enough to compete with low-wage economies, but the economy also doesn't have the skills, technology, and institutional capability to compete with advanced economies. So in industries that demand a large amount of relatively cheap labor, like manufacturing, we struggle to compete with the manufacturing powerhouses of the world. But in more innovative and high skills industries like technology, we also struggle to compete with the more developed nations. This is the middle income trap, which countries like ours, Brazil, Malaysia, have been stuck in for decades, and few countries such as South Korea and Taiwan have managed to escape. Add to this a persistently slow growing economy, and you have what we call a low growth middle income trap, which South Africa found itself stuck in 2012, and we are still stuck in today. The second key characteristic of the South African economy, still prevalent today, is economic concentration and distorted ownership. In a concentrated economy, a handful of large firms control entire sectors and industries, setting prices, controlling supply chains, and effectively, to a large extent, determining who can participate in the market. This economic concentration has historical roots because during apartheid, there was a deliberate and proactive effort to concentrate ownership in white controlled conglomerates. These white controlled conglomerates included mining houses, financial institutions, and retail groups, which were often vertically integrated over time, giving them a strong grip on a lot of key industries. Post apartheid, racially discriminatory legal frameworks were dismantled. Good progress. However, the pattern of economic concentration across key sectors still persists to this day, making it hard for new businesses to gain a foothold in major sectors of the economy and in a way that allows ownership to be better distributed amongst all South Africans or different groupings of South Africans. Business is competitive, and you can't blame dominant firms for asserting their position within the industry. But the fact remains, economic power in industries is concentrated among a few firms. And to a large extent in South Africa, wealth disparities are still very, very, very observable along racial lines, which is simply not sustainable. The third characteristic of the South African economy is the role of the commodity and service industries. These industries highlight an important duality in the economy of South Africa at the time, and maybe even today. The economy was characterized as largely growing through commodity exports, while the bulk of employment opportunities were created from low productivity domestic services like retail, security services, and domestic work. This results in three things. Firstly, the economy can experience growth through a commodity boom without meaningfully reducing unemployment or raising wages for the majority. Secondly, when commodity prices rise, the mining industry makes profit, GDP increases, and the rand strengthens. The strengthening of the rand, driven by the commodity boom, increases the price of outputs from other export industries like manufacturing and agriculture. An increase in the price of goods from these labor-intensive export industries makes them less competitive in the global market, as global buyers would prefer to buy at a cheaper price elsewhere. This negatively affects the global competitiveness of our non-commodity, labor-intensive industries, leading to them dwindling. So again, we can have economic growth from a commodities boom without a significant increase in employment. Thirdly, according to the NDP, most employment in South Africa is not created through mining and manufacturing, but is created in domestically oriented low-scale services like retail, private security, domestic work, and catering. These services are not traded internationally, so they struggle to scale. They do not require high skills, and they pay low wages. So job growth that is concentrated within these domestically oriented low-skill services helps, but does not improve living standards at an aggregate level for people in the country in general. So we have an economy whose growth is largely tied to commodities. But GDP growth due to a commodities boom, does not necessarily always translate into improved employment. And a lot of the employment growth at the current moment comes from low-skilled, domestically oriented services, which are low-paying and do not result in an aggregate improvement in the living standards of South Africans. Important and useful characteristics to be aware of. But honestly, beggars can't be choosers. And as things stand, I think it's more useful to get growth from whatever place it can come from in the country. Then, once a stable and consistent level of economic growth is maintained, we can begin to strategically discriminate between which sectors and industries we might prefer to get our growth from. But to begin with, we just need decent economic growth that is stable. The fourth key characteristic of South Africa's economy that is highlighted is that South Africa is very resource intense, or our economy is very resource intensive, meaning that our economy requires a large amount of natural resource input, which includes energy, water, resources, and land relative to the economic output that we generate. Add to this the sharp rise in water and electricity prices in South Africa over the past decade, and you have a relatively high cost of doing business in South Africa, which makes it hard for our firms in resource-intense industries and even businesses in general to compete on the global stage. Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan also highlights a number of strengths or comparative advantages, as well as a number of weaknesses or structural challenges that characterized South Africa's economy in 2012. Among the comparative advantages identified, which the nation would need to take advantage of if we were to stand any chance of competing in the global marketplace and growing our economy, include our mineral endowments, proximity to the growing African market, high-quality tertiary institutions, and our advanced financial services sector. Among the structural challenges of our economy at the time, some were highlighted as being generally characteristic of developing countries. These included the middle income trap and the large proportion of youth in the population structure that simply could not be absorbed into the labor force. The South Africa specific structural challenges that were highlighted include a lack of skills, inefficient and high-cost water and electricity services, which contribute to the high and often unsustainable cost of doing business in South Africa, as well as poor coordination and implementation of policy and plans across the public sector. Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan also lays out 3 employment scenarios which outline 3 possible outcomes for the economy by 2030. Based on policy implementation, performance against infrastructure commitments, the nature of investment in the economy, and the level of regional integration, the 3 scenarios lay out possible levels of GDP growth and unemployment by 2030. Scenario 3, which is the more optimistic one, envisions a South Africa with a GDP growth of 5.4% annually by 2030, while scenario 1, which is meant to be a bit more modest, foresees a South Africa with an average GDP growth of 3.3% annually by 2030. Currently, the average GDP growth is just under 1%, far from any of the 3 scenarios we envisioned back in 2012. Regarding the rate of unemployment, scenario 3 envisioned what today seems like a utopian 6% unemployment rate, while the more modest and less optimistic scenario 1 predicted a South Africa with an unemployment rate of 19% by 2030. The current reality, 31% unemployment rate. Either we're terrible planners and target setters, or we're just not good implementers, or maybe a bit of both. Whatever the case, we are on track to failing to meet even the lower end of the economy and employment-related scenarios that we envisioned for 2030. That's a fact. And now, with the assistance of the dashboard which I've compiled, which you can feel free to access through the link in the description to this video, I want to go through each of the key economy and employment targets that were articulated in Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan. And additionally, I'd like to give you a view of the progress toward these targets to date and how on or off track we might be from achieving these targets by 2030. If we look at and begin to navigate the dashboard, we see that there's 3 main sections. The first section shows a summary of the progress toward the 11 targets that are articulated in Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan. The second section looks at and shows the progress toward the employment-related targets set out in this chapter of the NDP. And then the third section lays out and looks at the progress toward the economy-related targets that are laid out in this chapter of the NDP. So if we start with the first section, the overview or the summary of the progress, we can see that of the 11 National Development Plan targets, 0 of them have been achieved to date. Unlikely, none of them are actually likely to be achieved by 2030. And of the 11 that are not achieved, one we've inferred that it also hasn't been achieved because it's not reported on, but I can confidently say, just from my reading of the data around that not reported target, that it's unlikely to be achieved by 2030. And then over there, we can just see right below that, we can just see a summary of the status of all of the different targets, and all of the different targets and the figures where we look at these targets and the progress toward these targets. So if you get straight into the data now, section 1, where we look at the employment-related targets, each of these targets, what I've done is we provided a title for the target, a brief description of the target, and then in each of the figures, what we have is we'd have a horizontal line showing the target that was set out for 2030, and then we'd have another horizontal line moving up and down, showing the annual progress toward that specific target, to give you a visual of what the stated target for 2030 was and what the progress toward that is. So the first target that we look at is the unemployment rate, which is the percentage of the labor force that is without work but actively seeking employment in South Africa. In the NDP, the 2020 target, which is in purple over there, was 14%. By 14%, we want, by 2020, we want 14% unemployment, and by 2030, the target was 6%. And we can see from 2012, we haven't gotten any closer to that 6% target that we're aiming toward for 2030. And at the current moment, unemployment is sitting at 31.4%. So very far off from the target there. And the second target is the employment ratio. And the employment ratio is the share of the working age population that is currently employed. So this is of the working age population, 15 to 64 years old, if I'm not mistaken, what percentage of those are currently employed? And we can see that the target for 2030 was to have 61% of the working age population employed, but at this current moment, the working age population, only 40.6% of the working age population is employed. And we can see that since 2012, this employment ratio has fluctuated between 40 and 45%. It's just stayed within that range, and there hasn't been any significant improvement. And actually, there's been a slight decline in the proportion of the working age population that is employed. Then figure 3 looks at the percentage of adults in rural areas that are working. And unfortunately, this target, from the data that I've been looking at, hasn't been reported on consistently. So I'm not able to paint a picture of what the progress is toward this target. But in 2012, 29% of adults in rural areas were working. And in 2030, the target is to get that to 40%. And just based on my reading, in terms of the development of industry such as agriculture and so on, and investment in rural villages, and changes in maybe poverty in rural communities, I really doubt that there's been a significant increase in the proportion of the proportion of adults working in rural communities, also just based on the employment statistics in South Africa. Possibly there's less than 29% of adults in rural areas working right now. So off track from achieving that target. And if you look at figure 4, we look at the labor force participation rate target. Labor force participation, that is the share of the working age population that is either employed or actively seeking work. So who is participating of the working age population, 15 to 64, who is participating in the labor market, meaning either working or actively looking for work. The target was that by 2030, we should have 59.3% of the working age population working or actively looking for work, or 60%, 65%, sorry, was the target for 2030. But at the current moment, we're sitting at 59.3%. So we're not too far from the 65% target, and this is probably the one target where we're achieving the target might seem somewhat possible by 2030, but just based on the trend over the past few years and the fact that in 2018, which is now 8 years ago, we were at the same labor force participation rate as we are today, increasing by 5% to reach that 65% target that we set out for 2030, I think is very low likelihood of that. So not on track to achieving that target by my assessment unless something dramatic changes. Then the final employment-related target is the public employment program opportunities. By 2030, the government aims to provide 2 million public employment program opportunities. But as of the latest data in 2022, the government was only providing 1 million public employment program opportunities. And the public employment programs, such as expanded public works programs, are employment programs, or programs for temporary employment that the government puts in place to try and accommodate unemployed people or people in the labor force that are struggling to find employment, and give them some sort of temporary opportunities to upskill themselves, gain some work experience, and just give them some level of employment, And this 2 million people benefiting from public employment program opportunities that was targeted for 2030, that 2 million target was meant to cover the shortfall of people who wouldn't be employed if we achieved the 6% unemployment rate target that we set for 2030. But we're very far off from that. We're sitting at about 31% unemployment now. So one could imagine that the 2 million target that was set for public employment program opportunities that is meant to cover the shortfall of unemployed people in the country, that 2 million target is far too small to ensure that almost everyone in the economy is at least working, even if it means temporarily within the public sector, and can gain some experience and make some money for themselves. So the target we set is definitely too low at the moment. The target that we set for 2030 for public employment program opportunities is definitely too low at this point, but we are unlikely to even achieve that. So that's the landscape when it comes to that's the landscape of the targets that were set out and the progress toward the targets related to employment in Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan. Now, if we look at the economy-related targets that were set out in Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan, Figure 5 over there goes into the first target, which is the increase in gross domestic product per annum. And the target was that every year the GDP, which basically represents the total value of goods and services produced in South Africa. The goal was that by 2030, the average increase in GDP per year should be 5.4%. And this is important because you increase the total value of goods and services produced in the country. That means there's more economic activity and output in the country, and that means more people can be absorbed into the economy and be gainfully employed. And this target of 5.4% GDP increase per annum is what would be required to absorb all the new graduates who enter the labor force into jobs and work when they graduate, and to over time absorb all the unemployed people since 2012 into the workforce, so that by 2030 we could get to a place where we have an unemployment rate of 6%. So that this GDP growth and this amount of economic value in the economy being generated was a prerequisite. It's needed if we were to get anywhere close to achieving the employment targets that were envisioned for 2030. And as you'd expect, we're far off from the employment targets. So the annual rate of GDP growth has also been dismal. So the economy is not growing at the rate that's needed to really support the population and provide all the young people that are graduating and, coming into the economy with jobs. That is simply the case. We can see that the latest value as of 2025, the GDP growth in 2025 was 1.1%, far off from the 5.4% target. And annually since 2012, according to my calculation, the average GDP growth per annum was 0.97%, just below 1%. So GDP growth far below what we targeted. And then if we look at the GDP per capita, which is basically the total value of goods and services produced in South Africa divided by the population in South Africa. And this is supposed to be a measure of the average living standard in the country. The target that was set out in 2012 was that by 2030, the GDP per capita should be 110,000 Rand. But the latest data that I've seen says the GDP per capita is 75,000 Rand. So again, far below the targeted GDP per capita and unlikely to reach that target by 2030. If you go down to figure 8, we see that the next target has to do with the proportional of national income earned by the bottom 40%. And this target is it's one which aims to make the economy and the distribution of wealth more inclusive, so that the people at the bottom get a greater share of the wealth that is circulating in the country. And the target was that by 2030, 10% of national income should be earned by the bottom 40%. And as of 2023, the latest data that I could find, only 6% of national income was being earned by the bottom 40% in the country, and that represents a 0.8% increase since 2012. And just based on that, 0.8% increase between 2012 and 2023, and the required about 3% increase that would be needed to reach this target of 10%. It's very unlikely, based on the trend, that this target will be reached by 2030. Then if you look at export growth, figure 9, the target was that by 2030, the average annual growth in exports should be at around 6%. Again, this target over here is something that's not very clearly reported on annually, so I had to kind of look through different sources to pull the data together. And based on what I could find, the average export growth since 2012 to date, from the data that I could find, is sitting at 2.9% per annum, far below the anticipated or the set 6% per annum target that we had for our country. If we look at the national savings as a percentage of GDP, this is the proportion of income set aside as savings, and that as a percentage of the total gross domestic product in the country. National savings as a percentage of GDP, the target that was set out for 2030 was to get to 25%. And instead of moving towards that target, we've gradually been moving away from it. And right now, our national savings as a percentage of GDP is slightly above half that 25% at 13.4%. Negative trend, not looking like we're anywhere close to achieving that target. And then the final target, the gross fixed capital formation and public sector investment as a percentage of GDP. So gross fixed capital formation, from my understanding, is just the total level of investment into the economy by the private and public sector. And this investment in the economy would be into things like infrastructure projects, machinery, and really activities that stimulate productivity and development within the economy. And the target was that by 2030, there should be a 30% investment, or by 2030, private sector and public sector should cumulatively invest 30% of the GDP into the economy. And currently, if you look at the yellow line, the investment of both public and private sector combined towards the economy as a percentage of GDP has declined from 19.3% in 2012 to 13.9% right now, which is very far off from the 30% target. And if you look at the public sector investment now by itself, the target for public sector investment into the economy as a percentage of GDP was 6% every year. And we can see that as of 2025, public sector is only invested 4.9%, only invested an equivalent of 4.9% of the GDP into the country. So what this means is that, or what we're seeing generally is that the level of investment into infrastructure projects and just the development in the country is far lower than what it should be from public and private sector. And we're seeing that the growth in the economy, as measured by the GDP, is also far lower than it should be. And this is creating an environment where there isn't sufficient economic opportunity and money in circulation to allow for the development of and thriving of businesses and growing of businesses in a way that allows them to absorb people into the labor force. And we have increasing levels of unemployment, particularly among youth. And yeah, when we look at the outcomes of or the progress towards the targets that were set out in Chapter 3 of the National Development Plan, these economy and employment-related targets, the picture is really, it's bleak, and it's bleak. It's bleak to say the least. There's a lot of ways that I'd want to describe what the progress is that might rather be harsh and I don't think are helpful. And in articulating the lack of progress that we're making and how we're actually moving in a negative direction, the hope is that this doesn't come off as any sort of attack on the state, anything like that, because that's far from what it is. But this actually inspires a certain level of reflection and introspection and acknowledgement of the fact that things are not headed in the right direction, and if we are going to stimulate the type of economic growth that's going to allow for the absorption or the creation of job opportunities that we need as a country, there has to be nothing short of radical, I don't really like the term radical, but very intense, and really the only term one could use is radical change to the way things are being done if we are going to change the trajectory of things, which is currently just unsustainable. And that's that, I guess. Thank you for your time. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that this video gave you a good view of the Chapter 3 of the NDP, the picture that it paints about the context and the characteristics of the South African economy, as well as the targets that it set out and the progress towards these targets. And at the very least, I hope this information on some level gives you a renewed sense of maybe what your role and responsibility in contributing towards the progress of this country in the right direction might be going forward. Thank you for your time and attention. Until next time, sharp sharp.